All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day number 2 of week 3 of the 2022 negotiated rulemaking with the Department of Education. I want to jump right into the substance of the day. We're going to start with a data presentation from the department on gainful employment, followed by discussion on that issue paper, moving towards a consensus check on gainful employment. But before that, I want to take a brief roll call of our negotiators. So if folks wouldn't mind coming on camera, representing accrediting agencies, we have Jamie Studley.
Good morning.
Morning, joined by her alternate, Dr. Laura Racer-King.
Good morning.
Morning. Representing civil rights organizations and consumer advocacy organizations, we have Carolyn Fast. We're still waiting for Carolyn, but we are joined by her alternate, Mr. Jalen Herbin.
Good morning.
Morning, Jalen. Representing financial.
Sorry.
Oh, is that Carolyn?
I know Carolyn was in the waiting room. No, this is Carolyn, or a few of us who were stuck there for a little bit. Or it might be worth checking.
It might be on my end, Yael, but I can't really hear you right now. I think your audio might be, it's a little scrambled, but.
Yeah.
Yael was just saying that Carolyn was stuck in the waiting room.
We're not showing,
was she?
okay. We're not showing Carolyn in the waiting room. We are showing a person that is logged in as 6th grade Daniel Tiger. We do not know who that is, and we cannot let them in until they identify themselves.
I'll let Carolyn know to change her name.
Okay, thanks.
We don't want to let any 6th graders in and expose them to the horrors of Regneg that early in their young lives. But moving on, we'll come back to Carolyn when she's able to log in. Representing financial aid administrators at post-secondary institutions, we are joined by Sam Dieter.
Good morning.
Morning, Sam. And her alternate, Mr. David Peterson. Morning. Representing 4-year public institutions of higher education, we have Marvin Smith.
Morning.
And we're joined by his alternate, Deborah Stanley.
Morning.
Representing legal aid organizations. We'll get to you soon, Barmack, don't worry. Representing legal aid organizations that represent students and or borrowers, we are joined by Johnson Tyler.
Good morning.
Morning, Johnson. And his alternate, Miss Jessica Renucci.
Good morning.
Representing civil rights organizations, we are joined by Amanda Martinez.
Good morning.
Morning, Amanda. Representing minority serving institutions, we are joined by Dr. Beverly Hogan.
Good morning, everyone.
And we are joined by her alternate, Miss Ashley Schofield. Well, looks like Ashley is not joining us yet, but we'll circle back. Representing private nonprofit institutions of higher education, we are joined by Kelly Perry.
Morning, everyone.
Morning. And her alternate, Emmanuel Guillory.
Good morning.
Morning. Representing proprietary institutions of higher education, we are joined by Bradley Adams.
Morning.
Morning, Brad. And we're joined by his alternate, Mr. Michael Lanouette.
Good morning.
Morning. Representing state attorneys general, we are joined by Adam Well.
Morning.
Morning, Adam. And we're joined by his alternate, Yael Shavit.
Good morning.
Morning. Representing state higher education executive officers, state authorizing agencies, and or state regulators of higher education and or loan servicers, we are joined by Debbie Cochran.
Good morning.
And her alternate, David Sokolow.
Good morning.
Morning, David. Representing students and student loan borrowers, we are joined by Mr. Ernest Oswego.
Good morning.
Morning, Ernest. And we're joined by his alternate, Mr. Carney King. No, Carney's not able to join us yet, but we'll circle back to him. Representing 2-year public institutions of higher education, we are joined by Dr. Ann Press.
Good morning.
Morning, Ann. Hope you are driving safely.
I am not driving. I want to make that
Good.
clear. I'm riding.
Good. And we're joined by her alternate, Mr. Will Durden.
Good morning.
Morning. Representing U.S. military service members, veterans, and or groups representing them, we are joined by Mr. Travis Hoare.
Morning.
And his alternate, Mr. Barmack Nassarian.
Good morning.
We are also joined by 2 advisors who provide support to the negotiating committee. First is a compliance auditor with experience auditing institutions that participate in the Title IV HEA programs. We are joined by Mr. David McClintock.
Morning.
Morning. And a labor economist with experience in policy research, accountability, and/or analysis of higher education data, Professor Adam Looney. Oh, Adam's has not joined us yet. Representing the department in the Office of General Counsel, we are joined by Mr. Steve Finley.
Hello.
And last, we are joined by our federal negotiator, Mr. Gregory Martin.
Morning.
All right, did I miss anyone? All right, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to the department at this time. I just have two quick items to touch on. One, just for the members of the public who are watching, I want to just reiterate that the department is not accepting written comments at this time. The appropriate time to submit those comments is the NPRN period of at least 30 days. Currently, the department is unable to utilize those comments and asks that members of the public refrain from submitting them at this time. So Brian, as I turn the floor over to you, I just want to run through our morning. We're going to turn it over to Brian. He'll run through the data that you've just received and take a few questions from them. I'm going to ask that the negotiators keep their comments and questions to that same 3-minute timeline that we've held you to the first 2 weeks, and that your comments express new questions or comments for the department and the committee's consideration. So with that, Brian and Renee, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thanks for the introduction, Brady. The purpose of my presentation today is to describe the informational rate information that was shared earlier with the negotiators. Please note that a corrected version of the data containing these information rates and an updated summary memo was distributed just before this meeting, and I believe is now publicly available on the website. The prior version misclassified programs with $0 or lower in the discretionary income rate denominator as passing instead of failing. The corrected version shows 619 failing programs, whereas the prior version that was distributed on Sunday showed 435 failing programs. The largest difference between the versions was for private for-profit certificate programs. And I'll show you a table later that kind of walks through those and the differences. Wanted to emphasize a few items in the memorandum as stated in the, or I guess the overview document. Thanks for sharing that, Renee. Yeah, as described here, due to limitations in what is available from relevant data sources that we have available to us now, there are differences between the data construction process of any informational rates and the proposed regulations. We know that different stakeholders will focus on different, the performance of different subsets of programs or institutions. So we've provided just the broad summary tables here in the memorandum and the overview. And we've also released accompanying data file so that users could take a closer look at the specific credentials or sets of institutions that are of particular interest to them. That was also updated this morning. The informational rate data file includes both GE programs and non-GE programs to provide context on the number of programs and awards granted by GE programs across different sectors and institutions. The data file includes earnings data and loan data for GE, where there were at least 30 individuals in the earnings cohort. The data file includes identifiers for HBCU institutions as well as tribal colleges and universities. We didn't include the other MSI designations like HSIs, which are designations that can vary across years based on enrollment. But that information can be added by data users who have access to the data file using data available in College Scorecard or the OPE website for MSIs. To talk a little bit about the earnings data, these data are based on College Scorecard data. Yesterday, College Scorecard released new program level earnings data. As mentioned previously, the informational rate data file includes only earnings data for the GE programs, with 30 or more in the cohort for the data file. Beyond that, there are a few differences between the data between what's in the data file and college scorecard. Essentially, the biggest difference is that the GE informational rate data are inflation adjusted to 2019 dollars, and the college scorecard data are inflation adjusted to 2020 dollars. For those familiar with the methodology used to produce program level median earnings under the 2014 regulations, it might be worth highlighting three key differences between data produced by the college scorecard and data that was produced by the Social Security Administration in the 2014 regulation. While the underlying data source of earnings is identical, there are several differences in how these data are processed. First, the data are produced at the 4-digit zip code rather than the 6-digit zip code. So that's different than 2014. Second, as described in this overview, and in a figure that was distributed earlier, it was kind of a picture that was distributed on Sunday. The scorecard measures earnings with longer lag between when students graduate and when their earnings are measured. So on average, this will likely lead to median program earnings estimates that can be substantially higher than what was calculated in the 2014 calculations. Finally, if you look at the college scorecard documentation, the median earnings estimates are perturbed by IRS to protect privacy of individuals. In other words, a small amount is either added or subtracted from the median estimated earnings using the raw data before it is published and even disclosed to us. As a brief summary of how the perturbed calculations differ from the actual medians, about 80% of the medians in college scorecard are within 3% of the published medians, and over half are within 1%. The statistics describing perturbation represent kind of an upper bound on differences when we're thinking about GE, because in scorecard they're based on sort of an N15 calculations rather than N30 calculations. There's more information about the perturbation and the privacy protection that IRS describes in the college scorecard documentation. I'm happy to share a link for those that are interested in that. I'm going to talk a little bit about debt now. In terms of debt, the department has proposed including institution and private loan debt in calculating median debt levels and capping calculations by tuition and fees. However, annual loan payments and debt include only federal loans without capping by tuition and fees. That's the only data we have available to us now. Further, other factors will make things different. For example, we rounded the aggregate cumulative debt to the nearest 100, which will also just make things kind of slightly different. I'm going to direct your attention to kind of what's on the screen and just note that the first table of the memorandum shows the number of GE programs in each category, as well as the proportion of programs and awards conferred in each category. Further, table 1 shows the number of GE programs with informational rate data, while the majority of awards conferred are represented in GE programs with informational rate data in private for-profit institutions. A smaller percentage of awards conferred are represented in GE programs in the other control categories. And again, this is the same table that was distributed on Sunday. Let's go to the next table. And it's going to be a little bit of a split screen because there's a page break, but I can say that, this second table shows the number of GE programs and their passing and failing frequencies for categories of, credential levels by control categories for the debt and earnings metric. The table shows that, for example, private for-profit institutions have higher proportions of their awards conferred in failing categories. As I mentioned before, this table has been updated this morning, the corrected version. The biggest difference in this table is that first row. The failing DTE number jumped from, I think it was 59 or 60 up to 210. The other numbers, if you kind of scroll below, none of those numbers, I think, changed by more than 10, but the difference between the corrected version and this version is the more substantial one was that first row. Let's go to the last table. And the third table of the memorandum, or I guess it's an overview document, shows that the number of GE programs and their passing and failing frequencies for the earnings threshold metric. Excuse me. If you kind of scroll down again, we have unfortunate pagination here, but you'll see the breakdowns again by credential level with the certificate programs broken out by control categories. So that's a gist of what was provided. And happy to take any questions about that at this point.
Okay, any questions for the department? I guess just a few brief announcements in terms of who's at the table. We have David in for financial aid administrators, Emmanuel in for private nonprofits, Yael in for state AGs, Barmac in for veterans and service groups, and then Carney, we are joined by Mr. Carney King. So good morning and welcome to everyone. Emmanuel, please take us away.
Sorry, experiencing some issues. So with the debt data that you included here, that's the debt data that's from the college scorecard, correct? No.
No,
okay.
that is different from the college scorecard. The college scorecard publishes debt for borrowers only. And so for the data in these data file, they include non-borrowers.
Do they also include Parent Plus loan debt?
They do.
In the file that you gave us?
In the file that we gave us, yeah. In the file that was circulated, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Brad, I see your hand next.
First, I'd like to thank Brian for the presentation and for the department to producing some data. Unfortunately, the timing of the data we've been requesting since January was given it to us Sunday night at 5:00 p.m. and then revised by 9:45. And frankly, I think and these comments are not directed to the folks that compiled the data, but your own memo on page 2 lists 6 different bullets of why the data is not accurate. And to present this data to this committee and then use that data to make a decision on our gainful employment issue paper is a problem. It's not accurate compared to the definition of the gainful employment statute we're reviewing. And the spreadsheet has 165,000 lines within it. And just the timing of it, and we haven't had a chance to really go through it, but I do want to point out 2 things of note. I think it's important for this committee is one on page 3, it talks about the overall program size of gainful employment. It does validate that 75% of the programs are not subject to GE. And so we'll discuss that later on the issue paper, but that is helpful. I do want to ask a question on, the second piece of information I find interesting is that private nonprofits and publics fail gainful employment as called out in several tables in this report. And if the failure rate was applied on a pro rata basis to degree programs at the associate through doctoral level, the vast majority of failing programs would be outside the proprietary industry. You know, unfortunately, the department has this data and could have applied the same metrics to all the other institutions at the same credential levels, and they chose not to do so, even though we've requested that information. The Texas Public Policy Research issued a report in February 2022 that states that 89% of all failing programs would be at publics and nonprofits. And that's unfortunate. We're not doing anything to protect those students from failing gainful employment programs. The last thing I want to mention is just on the earnings calculation. So I want to know, and I frankly have been unable to determine, what is the dollar amount being used in that earnings threshold in the very last table? Can the department disclose what that number is? And I'm assuming it's 2019 calendar year, but what is the overall number that we're using?
The number that we are, the threshold number?
Yeah, the median high school earner from national earner 25 to 34, I believe is the methodology. What is the number?
It's adjusted for state, so it's a different number for each one. So if you look at the Excel spreadsheet, I think the last column, or it's one of the last two columns, you'll see the specific number that's being compared against.
And given that I'm not going to be able to pull that off on the fly, can you just state the national median number without going into all the different state numbers?
Yeah, I don't have that at the top of my head. I will. I can try to find that quickly though.
That's going to be an important number for us as we go through this negotiation. And when you pull it, will you let me know if it includes $0 earners that are high school graduates, or if it excludes $0 earners?
So there's two versions in the data set. What we provided in the summary table is only the positive earners.
So we're excluding $0 earners from this file we're reviewing, which is different than what we're doing in gainful employment for graduates of programs.
So for graduates of programs, right, we include zeros in the proposed regulation. And then so for the comparison,
is admitting that they're not consistent on how they apply annual earnings in gainful employment. It's interesting. Yeah, if you could let us know that number, and I'll hold off any additional comments until we get that number, because that is very important.
Johnson, I see your hand next.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian, for the presentation here. I have a very specific question that I just can't get my head around. So if we look at page 4 of what was released today, the first table there, at the bottom, it says programs passing DTA without published DTA metrics. I don't understand what that means.
That means they would not fail, essentially, because we would not have data for them.
Okay. In other words, there's just no data on these programs. No
Correct.
Earnings data.
No debt and earnings data together.
Okay. And the other question I have is that, are the earnings that are being captured, are they from, what year are they from?
They're the combined 2018, 2019 calendar year tax earnings.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Brad, you're up next.
Thank you. Well, Brian's looking for that number, the national median number. I'd like to remind the department that the fact that we've been asking for this data, and it was obviously inaccurate what we've received Sunday and all reviewed, and now got a new file on Tuesday morning, that this entire rulemaking has just been around gainful employment has been an absolute disaster. And I think the administration is just forcing GE through as quickly as possible and not following through its standard negotiated rulemaking kind of procedures here. So I'd like to ask the department one last time to consider either pulling GE from this rulemaking to give it the consideration it needs as a standalone rulemaking like it's done in the past, or consider adding at least one additional session in April that we can vote to GE. There's a precedent for adding a fourth session, and the department can't agree to this today. So Greg, I'd like you to take that request back to your leadership, if you would, please.
Hello.
All right, thank you, Emmanuel.
Okay, I'm just trying to make sure I understand the data accurately because we did just get it this morning. So I want to make sure, you know, comparing and contrasting what we had before and what we have now. Okay, so with the total programs for private nonprofit institutions on page 3, which this document has 53,000 total programs. Are you saying, and I see above, okay, basically the question is, there are GE published programs. So there's qualifying GE programs and GE published programs. So the total GE programs, that's the 4,908 number. Those are published GE programs, correct? Just confirming.
So those programs are any sort of the legislative definition of GE that had at least one reporter, one award conferred reported in their IPEDS data collection. So it's anybody with in a GE program that had at least one completer.
At least one completer. So, okay, so if it's at least one completer, then that means that, so basically that'd be a cohort of 1, right?
At least.
So then this number would be all of the qualifying GE programs.
What do you mean by qualifying?
So what I mean by that is there are programs on campuses that are GE programs, but they are not published because they're under 30 students in the cohort. So the department previously only released data on the published GE programs. So that's the data we've been operating on since the 2014 rule, which we've been using and talking about and reviewing. This data, this informational rate data is something new that the department has done based on current data, and you're showing us, giving us an example, you know, of how our programs would fare under this new rule. So with this new data, I'm trying to make sure I understand and make sure it's clear for my fellow negotiators too as well, that the numbers we're looking at are either all of the GE programs on the campuses that qualify regardless of cohort size, because we're going to look at small program rates later on or talk about those later on, right? Or just only the published GE programs with 30 or more in the cohort.
So that number, the 4908 number, represents all of the GE programs, regardless of cell size. It's between okay. 1 and, you know, 1 million.
Yep.
It's not 0, so we do cut it off at 0, but it's at least one completer in the cohort. So it exists as a GE program with that definition. Does that help you?
Okay. Yes. Thank you. And then the total program column, that's just literally all of the programs on our campuses. Just all
Correct.
of them. Not their GE programs or not, just all the programs.
Correct.
Okay. Then I mean, this number, if you combine the publics and the private nonprofits, that's more than 18,000 qualifying GE programs, which we were looking at previous data. So that, you know, aligns. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Anne, I see your hand next.
Sure.
Anne, I
So
see your hand
I
next.
just want to follow up on a question that Brad asked to make sure I completely understand this. And I also want to indicate my frustration that, you know, this session began at 10 and we got this data, I think at 9:56 this morning. So this is a lot to try to process. But my question is, when we're looking at the earnings threshold for high school graduates with no GE completion. So what I heard was that if those high school graduates have no income, that they're excluded from the tabulation of the median, but all GE completers are in the tabulation. even if they have zero income. Is that correct?
So yeah, that sounds right to me, that when we do the median earnings calculation for a specific program, zeros are included, yes. And then for, I think this is exactly what you said, the comparison point, which is based on census sample data, those, we have 2 columns in the data file, but what you see the overview, it's limited to the high school, the typical high school earners that were working, had positive earnings only. So there is a difference.
So I guess I want to indicate an objection in the way that we're looking at this data, because there are lots of reasons why folks may not be employed, even if they went through and got a certificate or a degree that qualifies for gainful employment. Could be all sorts of, you know, personal choices that are in there. And to my mind, if we're going to include the zeros for one group, we really got to include the zeros for the other group. Otherwise, you're not really doing, I think, an accurate comparison of sort of a vision of the labor market. And I think someone else is not muted in the background.
If folks wouldn't mind going on mute just to eliminate some of the background noise. But I see Beverly, your hand is up next.
Yes, a brief comment is that I have to agree that this is a lot of information to kind of absorb and analyze in a short period of time to help us make clear and informed decisions. But let me ask a couple of questions here, following up on something that Emmanuel said. Are HBCU's data included in the private nonprofit institutions?
So, I mean, we yes. To the extent that there are, to the extent that the HBCU flag is in the data file, regardless of control category.
And the tribal control colleges and universities just have not published any information on their rates, data, and you don't have anything on them. How is that handled?
Correct. So, for example, because they have small programs, for example, we wouldn't have information on small programs.
Okay. And in this analysis, and I'm having difficulty kind of going between a document I printed and the document that you all sent this morning, because because of visual challenges that I have, I'm not really able to read the new document on my screen. You had a footnote in this analysis. HBCU status is defined based on an institution's 6-digit OPIAT. Can you explain that a little bit more for me so I can understand it?
Yeah, so the HBCU designation, there are some HBCUs, I think there's one in particular where I think the law school branch is not considered HBCU, but if you were to kind of consider the whole main campus, that includes kind of this separate branch campus, which is separately not considered HBCU. As long as kind of one entity within multiple branch campuses were considered an HBCU, we would mark that as an HBCU.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Brad, your hand's up next.
Thank you, Brian. I'm curious, do you have any of this data broken out by gender, age, or race, or rural other than state, I guess location other than state? Does the department have access to that information?
So the college scorecard produced earnings by gender, and that was released yesterday. We don't have race. Or what was the other category you mentioned?
Our location other than state.
No. And I do have an answer for you on your prior question. The national figure was, hang on a second, 25,400.
Did you get the number what it would be without the I mean, including the zero earners?
I don't have that one yet, sorry.
Okay, that's okay. I'm curious if they've at least got it by gender, if we could get the male-female breakdown. And really what I'm looking for is what percentage of the high school median earnings are white males. I'd like to get that information from the department, if you can get that, or at least get it by gender, if not.
You're saying with the census data? See if
That'd be
the
great.
sample size is. We can look into getting that. I'm not sure if we'll be able to, at what timetable we'll be able to get that, but we'll.
As you probably are aware, most of the programs that are considered failing within the private for-profit certificates are cosmetology programs. Those tend to be a higher percentage of female graduates within those numbers, in some instances significantly different. And, as you know, there's all kinds of earnings issues in that industry. And so to show 51% of those programs are failing in earnings threshold, we need to take into consideration some of the other demographic information that may be available to us in that area. But I would like to ask the department one additional question, and it was on a file that was sent on Sunday. I like this file. It was the timeline file, but there was a comment in this file, and I didn't know what it meant. I don't know if you could share that for the public. It was the one-pager earnings metric kind of timeline. That's okay. But either way, there was a comment that says calendar year 18 earnings are inflated to 2019 dollars, and the median of the earnings from both cohort years combined is computed. I was not sure if you could explain what that means.
So to the extent that the median earnings is across, hang on a second, let me think about this. So the 2018 reported dollars are adjusted to 2019 dollars, and then the median is taken across the two cohorts. Does that make sense?
So is it a 2-year median average? I'm not following. I'm sorry, Brian.
Sure. We might have to check how this works, but I believe how it works is that you basically, let's say you and I had I had like $10,000 earnings and you had $20,000 earnings. We would adjust, I had mine a year prior to yours. We would adjust mine to, let's say, $15,000, and then we'd rank order like you, me, and everybody else in the cohort. And then we would see who's in the middle to draw the median. Does that make sense?
So you would inflate the 2018 annual earnings up and then take the median of the entire population. Is that another way?
Yes.
And
so we were comparing apples to apples, essentially.
Are we using some sort of government-produced CPI for the increase from 18 to 19?
Yes, the BLS data.
That is a helpful answer. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Johnson, I see your hand next.
Thanks. I'm going to follow up with Emmanuel's questions on today's release of information and go back to the table on page 3. So on the private nonprofit, it has this percentage of total completions in G program, it's 5.7. So does that mean out of the 4,900 G programs, only 5.7 are having enough completers to be counted for the G analysis?
So the 5.7, is more about individuals, or what we call kind of awards completed, sort of completion events. So it's weighted. It's not the number of programs. It's actually the number of like people that are completing.
students. Okay. So in essence, though, when you look at the 4,908 GE programs, only 222 or 240 are scoreable for purposes of GE. Is that what the next column is saying?
Correct.
And that's because there's not enough completers, or that's because there's not enough data to do the analysis once you've identified the people?
So I think that's the same thing, right? If there's not enough completers, that means there's not enough data.
Okay. So in other words,
the
N number's too small. These are
correct.
Small programs. Okay. And so this last column, I'm just getting I'm having a hard time understanding what it means.
Yep.
Percentage of GE credentials awarded with published DTE earnings. So that means 59.5% of GED's GE credentials are being awarded private nonprofits that don't have a large enough number of completers or data to be scored. Is that
Again,
right?
this is the proportion of kind of people completing. And so what like this first column is saying is that, you know, this 2799 number, that's the number of programs we have. So how many, this 87.9% is the number of like people that are completing that's represented in that 2799. Because some programs are bigger and smaller, so you could have like almost all of your students represented in a smaller number of programs.
I understand. Okay.
So that's what that.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay, thank you. Emmanuel, please.
Well, I think that by looking at this further, I may have answered my own questions. Obviously, understanding the data is very important, and just want to make sure I think we all get a good grasp on what we're looking at here. Once again, because we got it not too long ago, but it's not much different than what was in before. And I apologize for asking about the Parent Plus thing, because I do see you still kept that in here. It literally says it in the first line. But I think just having time to read through it was challenging. As it relates to, I know one of my colleagues asked for the HSI data, you weren't able to provide that. And in looking at the HBCU data, the Tribal College and University data, just not really seeing that kind of spelled out. I know you say that only 3 programs for HBCUs fail out of 332 GE programs at HBCUs. And then further down, you say there's a total of 332 GE programs out of the 3,654 programs offered by HBCUs. But it would be helpful to see a breakdown of, and I know it's harder for the minority serving institutions because they do vary based on, you know, the metrics to meet it in Title III and V. But for those that are statutorily defined, like HBCUs and TCUs, it would be nice to see a breakdown of that. And I will say that in looking at this, going back to what my colleague Johnson, when he was going through the private nonprofit numbers on page 3 in this particular table here, 222 of our programs out of the 4,908 total GE programs are literally what it says published GE programs. So those are the ones that have 30 or more in their cohort, right?
Yes.
Okay. So when we do the small program rates, is it true that we're now going to capture more than 222 programs
Yes.
and their rates?
Yes.
Okay. Would we potentially capture all 4,908 of those programs? I mean, as long as their 4-year cohort combined is 30 or more students, we would more than likely capture a large majority of that 4,000 number, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, there's ways to kind of estimate that by for example, seeing how many are in 15 and, you know, multiplying by 2.
Yeah.
So those are
Yeah.
things that you could try to do with the IPEDS data.
Yeah. Well, I would say just based on the definition of small program rates the department is using and then how that calculation will actually take place, we will capture obviously way more than 222 programs. We'll probably capture a majority of the 4,900 here, but that would be the same too, though, for the public institutions as well, right? Because according to your data, they have 968 programs that are published, that be published GE programs, but then they have 28,000 that are total GE programs. So the small program rates would capture a large number, that 28,000.
Yes, it would capture more.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Adam, our advisor, I see your hand.
So I guess watching this dialogue, my first observation is that I thought the data looked quite similar to what you'd get from the 2015 data and from what I showed a couple weeks ago, in the sense that if you look at that table on page 3 of the document, you know, that has the first row is the total number of programs. The second row says among all the programs at those universities, which ones are GE programs. The third column there is the fraction of students in those programs who are at those universities who are in GE programs. The fourth column is the number of programs that actually have a published metric. You know, it has 30 or more students. And then to that comment about informational rates, or the programs that have less than 30 students. You know, obviously that number 222 for private nonprofits, that will go up in the sense that there'll be more informational rates. But correct me if I'm wrong, I thought that there was no sanction associated with those, and that they'd be purely informational, so that they're not a high stakes, so to speak, element. And then, you know, just for completeness, the fifth column is the fraction of total students in GE programs that have published rates that would be effectively subject to a penalty or a sanction under this regime. And so I guess my broad observation is that it looks quite similar to the data that you've seen before. And if you're familiar with the 2015 data, I don't think you should think this is a big change in terms of the content and the broad message.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Debbie, I see your hand.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions related also to the issue of the median earnings data and the inclusion or exclusion of the $0 earners. One very specific question is that looking in the file and comparing those two figures, it looks like the territories don't seem to have a difference where the states do. Is there some sort of data difference there?
You mean the comparison? How are the territories? The territories use the national comparison rather than a state adjusted one.
So the kind of for America, I think in column A and D is the all earners, whereas AE is the positive earners.
Correct.
And so, like for American Samoa, they're both 18,735, whereas those figures are different for the states.
Right. And the states are adjusted and the territories are not. States are adjusted for sort of regional differences.
But it looks like, I guess there's the $0. It seems like there might be a difference in terms of whether there's a positive earnings filter placed on them.
Okay, so the AD and AE are different because based on sort of census data, there's kind of a national high school earnings level sort of for sort of just the workers or for everybody. And so that's the difference you're seeing between the two.
Okay. Let me, so just in terms of the other, my other questions, is there anything you can say about the extent of the difference that a couple folks have asked about in terms of the, like, how many people in either cohort are $0 earners, or just kind of what the department's thinking was in terms of that comparison?
I'll defer to my colleagues on sort of the rationale for including or not including the zeros. The difference, we're still, I think Brad asked for kind of both numbers, and we've only have one at this point, and we'll work on the other to understand the difference at a national level, the difference between high school workers and all high school high schoolers.
Okay. Deb, anything else?
No, I'll leave it there.
Okay. Ann.
Sure. I just want to go back to a point that Adam Looney just made, and I want us to be really careful because it reflects on something that Emmanuel was talking about, that yes, these are similar tables, but the reality is what they're telling us is that the results in those tables will be dramatically different if we go forward with these changes. And so that, I think, is what's causing a lot of the questions this morning, is that we're proposing, and that's the whole point of negotiated rulemaking, right? We're proposing at the department level to make some significant changes, and setting aside the merit of those changes, right? That would change significantly what you see in those tables and how those programs are counted, how those graduates are counted. And I also want to go back to something about the small program size. GE programs by nature are often very small. They're not going to draw thousands of students. So how you treat the small number of students who have come to those programs, how you provide them that access to the financial aid that many of them count on to participate in these programs, is going to be incredibly important. So just for anyone watching, I think that's a lot of what you're seeing in this discussion, is that the tables may look similar, but what's going to be inside of them going forward is very, very different, and that will have real world impact on the lives of our students.
Thank you. Brad, your hand is up next.
Yes, just want to second Ann's point here that, you know, the final two charts in this presentation is completely compiled with inaccurate data as currently described in the 2022 GE issue paper. So just want the public to realize that we are reviewing data that the department describes through 6 different bullet points, how it is inaccurate. But I do want to point out on table 3, which I think is probably the only thing that's using accurate data, and that's the percentage of GE programs. And I just want to call out, that's interesting, that only 3% of public institutions' certificate programs have more than 30 completers in a 4-year period. And of that, it's only 1% of all programs at public institutions. So once again, 99% of programs at public institutions are not subject to gainful employment. Maybe that's why they have such low failing thresholds, because the other 99% are not even looked at. It's interesting to me, out of everything in this information, this table on page 3 shows the full picture of how many students aren't protected from this GE regulation. And it's just really unfortunate that the department and the committee just looks right past the fact that so many students attend institutions that have programs that are not covered by GE. And we're basically saying to them, we don't care if you're gainfully employed or not. You can go pay as much as you want for that education. And that's unfortunate that this committee feels that way. Thank you.
All right, Emmanuel.
I just wanted to quickly add that in response to comments that Adam had made, one of the reasons why I was going through the table on page 3 the way that I did is because we do have people watching that may not necessarily understand what all the numbers mean per se. So I just want to make sure it's clear that we all know what we're looking at and people, we all just understand that. But another thing is too, with the small program rates, the reason why I brought that issue up is because even though, Adam, you had mentioned that the department's not using the small program rates to determine Title IV eligibility, basically, to make it, simplify it, there's concern within the proposed rule on page 18 as it relates to certification procedures, section 668.13, with the usage of small program rates as it relates to program participation agreements and approving those or recertifying those or putting them on provisional status. And so it is listed that small program rates would be something the department could look at and take into consideration. So that brings us pause a little bit. So that's why I was wanting to just make sure that with a small program rate, capturing additional programs beyond the published 222 programs that we're seeing here in this chart.
Okay. Thank you. Not seeing any other hands. First, I just want to thank Brian for the data presentation. That was very helpful. And just in terms of, I think, some of the outstanding requests, just per the protocols, the department will either respond or provide a rationale as to why they cannot, whether it's time constraints or availability of data or whatever. But I just want to remind folks of their protocols as we return to discussion. But first, I do see, Jamie, your hand. Right now, I think you're
the cursor disappears when you need it the most. It would be helpful to me to have a sense of how the department plans to move through GE and these complicated issues. I, for one, would welcome the department's linking the data to the rule that's been proposed so that we can understand how they believe it supports the very specific regulatory provisions that we are going to be asked to support or decline to support. And I don't know if that, I appreciate Brian's description of the data, but could the department give us a sense of how they see the flow so that we can do the work with the data to try and understand how they relate to the particular provisions, the changes from 2014, and so on.
So I think what we've provided sort of is the best available information. A lot of the data elements that are noted, the limitations include the fact that we don't include private loans and institutional loans. And we essentially don't have that unless we implement the rule set. Are those the specific things you're talking about, the methodologies, or are you talking kind of broader than that?
I think I'm talking more broadly than that. You've done the best you can with what's available to provide us with the data. The department has made a proposal. I'm wondering if the department will help us say, here's how this supports the key provisions. So, Brian, it's probably not your job. Okay. I say that with tremendous respect. You've brought this forward. And my question is, how are we going to look at, will we interleave as we go through the provisions of the section, how the data support it? That's what I'm looking for from the policy recommendation side of the department. The 2014 rule has been through that kind of analysis. We have some significant decisions that we'll have to make. And I just wonder, so that we know where to put our comments and what work we can will be brought to us to support those recommendations. Whether we're expected now to totally leave the data, whether the department will help us weave it together with the sections, and you know, we're looking at what the numbers are. How do the numbers relate to the policy recommendations? So it's not a question for you, Brian. It's really a question for the, I think probably the ed negotiator and Dr. Looney. It's not that I need an answer right now. Maybe I can put it another way. I am feeling a need to crosswalk the data and what it tells us about why these are the best, why these are the proposals the department thinks we should make. I saw real power in the 2014 rules in what it did in terms of effects, and I'd like to end up having to vote on something that I can understand in terms of whether it will be positive in as well.
Greg, I do see your hand up.
Yeah, I certainly understand the desire for, you know, more data or more analysis. I could say at this point that we've provided all we feel we can provide at this point. I don't intend to do any more crosswalking of data. We'll walk through the issue paper as it is. Where you have specific questions that involve data that I can't answer, I will try to get an answer today for that. I do want to point out that being fully aware and respectful of where everybody is and always the desire to have more information that we are charged with getting through this week. We will take a vote on consensus today, and everybody will have to act in accordance with their conscience, their own beliefs, and what we have in front of them. Which is not to say that I don't want to address concerns. I will make every attempt to address questions and concerns where they come, but we will not be able to provide any additional data. We're at day 2 of 5 days in the last session. So at this point, I would ask people to consider how they will look at this based on what we have, which again, if you have specific questions related to specific areas we walk through, as it concerns the data, I'll make every effort to try to get an answer for them.
Okay, thank you. Barmack.
I want to thank the department for providing what it has. I realize how difficult the task they've been assigned with is. So I want that as the context for my comments. I have to tell you, I don't find the data particularly enlightening here. They add some insights, but the variances in the inputs are so complicated and they work in such potentially mysterious interactive ways that I really cannot draw any conclusions on the basis of these data about the likely impact of what we're doing. But having said that, I should also point out that from a strictly scientific point of view, we are attempting to look at a phenomenon with an instrument. And if the phenomenon is unknown, the best you can do is attempt to construct a reliable instrument. That reliable instrument consists of the normative decisions we make about the rule. I really want to caution people from drawing glib conclusions from any of the facts that may be available to them from these data, because the fact that X% of programs may fail, be that a low number or a high number, does not in itself mean anything. It only means something if you start with some assumption that these programs are all great programs, and the fact that many of them fail indicates that the calibration device you're measuring stuff with is wrong. That is not a correct conclusion. It may well be that the programs are really garbage, and the instrument you've constructed is actually accurately reflecting the goals that the normative judgments you made in constructing that instrument was intended to accomplish. So I appreciate the need for data. I realize we need to know what the impact of regulations are, but in general, government is not omniscient. You can't expect every public policy decision to give you absolute precision in terms of impact. You should have a sense of that impact. Given the fact that we're not likely to have consensus here, the department will have additional months to hone its methodology and address any concerns. I have some concerns I'd like to address, but this notion that this is data-driven is just erroneous. We're looking at a very indistinct landscape here with an instrument that we can only devise on the basis of our judgment, not on the basis of what it measures, because we don't know what it's measuring.
Thank you, Barmac. Jamie, please.
In the words of one of the department's wisest data people many years ago, you need to have the data, but the data will not make the decision for you. I absolutely agree, Barmac. What I was responding to was the hunger that people have to try to understand what the data do reveal to us as we go through, and what support we can get from it. But I absolutely agree that the decision about whether this appears to be wise policy to address serious areas of concern, it remains. Not to try and ask you to answer it right now, but one possibility, especially with this fresh data, is to go as far as we can with GE today, but decide whether it would be more prudent to allow us to return to it later in the week. But I leave that to the department and the facilitators, and look forward to getting into the substance of the sections.
All right, I appreciate the transition. Right now, I will just say from the perspective of the facilitation team, it is our intent to pick up discussion on the issue paper for gainful employment this morning through the afternoon, and then take a consensus check this afternoon. That is the intention. But with that, I do want to turn it back over to the department to key up discussion to return to gainful employment, with, again, reiterating my thanks to Brian and the department's data team.
Thanks, Brady. Yeah, with that, I'll have Renee queue up the text. And yesterday we finished, and before we start, I definitely want to add my thanks to Brian Fu for his excellent presentation and for being willing to be with us and not only presenting but fielding all of your questions. So in subpart Q in 668 402, we were looking at definitions, and where we left off yesterday, we had discussed through the definition of cohort period. So today we'll pick up with the definition of earnings threshold. So we'll go through these definitions, and then we'll stop at the end of the definitions and have an opportunity for discussion at that point. So I'd like to start today with the earnings thresholds. So this introduces something new over what you saw in session 2, the introduction of the earnings threshold. So we'll just walk through this. Based on data from the Census Bureau, the median earnings for a working adult aged 25 through 34 with only a high school diploma or GED in the state in which the institution is located, or nationally if fewer than 50% of the students in the institution are located in the state where the institution is located. And we've added this definition for the earnings threshold, which is the median earnings for the working adult aged 25 to 34 with only a high school diploma. And again, this is derived from the Census Bureau. Below that, under federal agency with earnings data, you see here the inclusion of the earnings threshold. So this is a federal agency with which the department enters into an agreement to access earnings data for the DE rates and earnings threshold measures. And that concludes the changes for definition. So I'll stop there and entertain any comments on what is in proposed 668 402 definitions.
All right, thank you, Greg. Brad, your hand is up first.
I think, yeah, I'd like to propose to the committee, I mean, definitions are 5 pages of this 19-page document, that we stick at least by page to have some sort of order to this analysis. I'm open if you don't want to do that, Greg, but I do think it would help on this.
Well, I do want to point, I mean, I take your point, Brad, but I'm not going to walk through the entire document, just where we've made changes over the previous week.
Well, Greg, if you don't mind, I'd like to just ask a couple questions here of the department, but I'd like to just confirm that the gainful employment definition under statute in the Higher Education Act does not specifically reference any debt to earning metric or any earnings metric or really any metric in particular on just the definition of what is a gainful employment program. Can you just confirm if that's accurate?
I'll ask Steve to add to that, but yeah, the definition, the statutory definition, you're correct, does not reference metrics. It simply defines a gainful employment program. But the department does consider, and it has been sustained legally, that we do have the authority to regulate in that area. Steve, do you want to add to that?
That's a correct statement. And Brad's statement's correct. There's no reference to debt to earnings metrics. It's for programs that prepare students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation.
Just a follow-up question to that then, Greg. Does the department have the ability to calculate a debt to earning metric comparable to the debt to earning metric for a gainful employment program in section 668.43 or a separate subpart? Does it have the legal statutory authority to basically request that all other programs calculate a disclosure?
I'll let Steve address that. It's just a legal question.
I'll make sure I'm not muted. There's certainly broad authority to the department to provide information to students, prospective students, and families about educational programs.
It could be calculated in a similar format as what's being proposed in this issue paper.
Yes, we could. Yes. Are we capable of calculating rates for those programs? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So I spent a considerable amount of time in order to meet the deadline that was 1 week after our last session ended, proposing a separate subpart for that calculation that would not subject these programs to the actual losing Title IV eligibility as a gainful employment program would. It was just a simple calculation. And as I read in 668.43, there is a request for earnings information as well as debt information. So I'm just curious if the department could answer why they chose not to include any of my proposed language on a disclosure for the programs not subject to GE, understanding that that disclosure would not impact the program's ability to retain their Title IV aid based on the results of the metrics. So can you just answer why we're choosing not to disclose that key information to the 75% of programs we just reviewed that aren't subject to GE?
Well, I don't want to preclude the departments ever looking at I mean, there certainly is a lot of information on the scorecard about all programs. You're talking about applying the metrics that we have here for gainful employment programs to all programs and publishing data on that. I can only say, Bradley, that currently the department has no intention of doing that. We did consider your request. Right now, we're limiting it to just gainful. Those programs that are affected, whose eligibility is affected under gainful employment, and I don't have anything else to say on that matter now. That's about all I can. Unless Steve wants to add something.
Yes, Steve, go ahead. Oh, this time you're muted, unfortunately.
It happens. Thank you. I think there's a lot of better information about a lot of programs that are evidenced in the proposals here, whether it creates what you're suggesting, which would seem to be a directly comparable metric. I don't see that there, but there is a desire to improve the information about the programs that shows up in a lot of the discussions this week. Your proposal was noted, and we're moving forward to continue the discussions that have already been started.
Well, thank you for your response. I do want the committee to understand what was just stated, though, on the record, is the department could, if they chose to do so, calculate a debt to earning rate for all programs at all institutions. And so by voting for this gainful employment issue paper as currently written, would basically not protect those 75% of programs when we could easily do that. So a no vote to me is a vote against protecting students at all institutions and all programs. But I do have a specific question on page 2 I'll go into next. It's on the SIP code and the 4-digit verse 6. And I don't feel like we ever got a good explanation in round 1, other than we wanted more insights on, subject to it. But, I'm struggling. I did some SIP code research this morning, and 5109 SIP code, which is called, pull it right back up here. Let's see, Allied Health Diagnostic Intervention and Treatment Professions. Physician assistant, which is a master's level program accredited by AHRQ, is in the same category as surgical technology, which it used to be a certificate program, now it's an associate program under a different accreditor. Very different terms, very different outcomes, very different pay rates. So why, if a surgical tech program failed, this as written, we would not be allowed to open up a new physician assistant program? We're talking like 4 or 5 times different salary. Can the department just address why they didn't look at 5108 and 5109 and lumped all these things together? I mean, 5108 has a medical assistant and
your time is up.
Right. I'll let the department answer. Thank you.
In constructing the rule, we didn't look at specific. Didn't look at specific programs. I take your point. I think that that the rule has been written in consideration of issues more broad than that. And we did, as I said before, in the previous sessions, want to include a broader scope of programs so that there would be rates for more programs. There is a in any regulatory activity, there is a you can't hit everything exactly the way you want it. There is a give and a take. And by and large, and it is true that when you go to a 4-digit SIP, it does lump more of those programs together. On balance, we still believe this is the right way to go.
Thank you. And it's top. I just want to remind the committee that folks are always welcome to re-queue if they hit that 3-minute timeline. We know it goes fast, but you're always welcome to re-queue for new comments and questions for the department. But Emmanuel, please go ahead.
I just had a question regarding the definition of a 2-year and 4-year cohort. I noticed the department made some changes there, and I wanted to make sure that I understood, because based on the 2-year cohort, for example, it starts off with the 3rd and 4th award years, but when I do my calculations and looking at the actual award years listed, it seems to be the 5th and the 6th award years from 2021, at least, based on how this is worded. So I just want to get clarification on that. And then I also wanted to ask, when it relates to the earnings data years that would be used, so it has 2018 and 2019, how does the department envision using both of those years? I mean, I know it's the median of the earnings, but are you looking at earnings in 2018 and 2019 and doing a median of the earnings across both years? Because it seems like it would be easier to pick a year, pick 2019 and just do the earnings from that year and do the median. But I just wanted to make sure I understood what the department was doing in both the 2-year and the 4-year cohort regarding those things.
Let me get a clarification for that. So just to go back, Emmanuel, to your first concern about the years specifically, so you're looking at for the 2-year cohort, the 3rd and 4th years prior to the year for which the most recent data are available. That's where you are, and yeah. So just to be clear, so that we can answer this for you, to assess programmatic eligibility in the award year 22-23 would be calculated in 2021. The 2-year cohort period being 2014, 2015, and 2015-2016, right?
Mm-hmm.
So your concern there is that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not really a concern. It could be whatever the years are. You know, I don't really care what the years are. I just wanted to make sure that, you know, this says 3rd and 4th years, and that seems to be the 5th and the 6th award years. And I just wanted to see what am I missing with that? And then, so let's just stop there. So yeah, just.
Okay, I'll get a clarification on that for you. And also the earnings.
Yeah, and then the earnings over the 2 years, why doesn't the department choose 1 year and look at the earnings? In my opinion, from 2019 to 2019, why not look at 2019 earnings in that year for all the students in that cohort, compare them for that year and do the median that way? What's the point of the 2 years and how would that work together is really what I'm just trying to better understand.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Cindy, I think I hear you. For some reason, I'm not getting sound from your end.
That I just want to pick up on something Brady said in an effort to help the committee navigate their way through this document and to help the department better understand your concerns and to hear any proposed changes to what they've put out there for their consideration during this discussion. We ask that you limit your 3 minutes to things that have not previously been stated and are clarifying questions or a new concern and offer any suggestions that you have to the changes you see before them. GE is a topic that is going to move forward. And so we want to try to make the most productive use of the time for you to get the information and the department to get the information they need.
Thank you. With that, Brad, I see your hand up next.
Thank you, Cindy. In all due respect, every one of my comments was tied to a comment in my issue paper that I responded with. And so I would like to make sure that this committee, who's only reviewed this for a second time, and there's a brand new metric that causes GE programs to fail, is considered, and we have the right amount of time. So I do think we need to make sure we're spending our time on this. I would like to ask the department now I'm on page 3 in the 2-year cohort period where Emmanuel was just referencing. So if I'm reading this right, we roll it forward 1 year. We're rolling right into the COVID 2020 year in this proposal. Has the department considered that impact? I mean, it's the biggest pandemic and unemployment rates reaching 30% at certain points since the Great Depression. Is that really what we want to do as a committee, is roll right into a COVID year on the first year out the gate on this? Just what's the department's thoughts on 2020 as a salary year?
Thus far, I mean, it's included. We haven't proposed to exempt that year for in consideration of COVID. I'll take the concern. I'll take the concern back.
My proposal suggested that we start earnings in 2022 forward, so that we would start in 2024, or I guess it'd be 2024 or 2025. I have to do the timeline math here, but to start right in the worst pandemic of all of our lifetimes would be not the appropriate thing to do. Let me ask on the residence programs, why are we limiting it to just medical and dental, which is Romanet 2? Because there's many other programs, doctoral level or even master's level, that have residency programs. Some are required, some are not. And why are we limiting it to just basically DO and DDS programs in Romanet 2?
Yeah, we certainly, I do understand that there are other programs besides the medical and dental internships and residency. One, and this pretty much mirrors the previous regulations. When we think of a residence, a classical residence, this is what normally comes to mind: dental and medical, and the huge differences in income that accrue to those graduates as you look over that period. If you're making a suggestion to include other types of resident, and I think also when you move beyond medical and dental, you start to get into any number of programs that could have something that they call a residence or an internship, and I think the potential for it to include just an unlimited number of programs starts to emerge.
Thank you, Gary. I did include that proposed language in my submission, so I do think we need to include others. But maybe this is a good time. It's either here or on page 4. But talking about credential levels, I proposed where graduate programs would be excluded from the actual, not from the DE calculation, but from losing Title IV eligibility. And there's various reasons for that. Since that proposal, there's been some talk on this committee around excluding programmatically accredited programs that lead to licensure.
30 seconds, Brad.
And did not know if the department has thought about, a program like, we'll just say, Doctor of Physical Therapy, where it has a license requirement, a programmatic requirement to then take, and then essentially thus meeting a gainful employment criteria of passing licensure. Has the department thought about that in some of the comments that have been brought up?
Yeah, we have given consideration to everything submitted to us. With respect to graduate programs, we do have concerns about the debt levels which are being taken on for a lot of graduate programs, and especially related to the earnings potential out there for them. With medical and dental, there is obviously once you have a medical degree or dental degree, and an earnings potential that far exceeds that many other programs. So that's going back to the exclusion of the residents. About the extension of the 6th and 7th award years for medical and dental residents. With respect to excluding graduate programs altogether, the department is not going to go in that direction.
Well, again, there are other programs with salary outcomes like dentists and doctors. CRNAs.
Brad, your time is up.
So I'd like the department to consider.
I'll take back the suggestion for about the residence and internship programs as far as excluding graduate programs go. I can say now that that's not something which is on the table.
Ann.
Sure. So my question is on page 5. It's at the very bottom of the page. It's C1 Romanet 3. And so the department has a change here that the denominator, median, annual, or discretionary earnings of either rate is 0, and the numerator, median debt payments, is 0. So can you explain why it's not sufficient alone that the numerator is 0? Why it has to be and rather than just the numerator being 0?
You're talking about in 403?
Yep, I'm in 403 at the
We
very
did-
bottom of the page.
Yeah, let's wait till we get there, because we didn't get there yet.
Oh, you're not there yet? Okay.
No, we just finished forward. We just went
Okay.
through the definitions for it too, but
All
we
right,
will
so
address
I'm going to
it.
come back in the queue when we get there. Then.
Okay.
Anything else on the changes for week 3 definitions, Brad?
Yes. Let's see here. So I'm curious on the earnings threshold, what the driver was in choosing the threshold that the department chose. We reviewed 4 for about a total of 10 minutes in week 2, and the department has obviously chosen a threshold based on median earnings, age 25 to 35 with a high school diploma or GED. I'm just curious why we landed on that.
I mean, obviously there are various options. So we were looking at doing a reasonable comparison with a threshold, and what is it reasonable to assess these programs against, and a high school graduate at that level. We determined that would be a reasonable place to be and assess these programs. I mean, I can try to get more details as to the thinking behind it, but that's. I mean, do you have anything to add to that, Steve?
No.
It's just the frustration is, I mean, this is now a threshold upon which a program would lose its Title IV eligibility. And we spent more time talking about transcript withholding. It wasn't even in an issue paper. And then we spent talking about this threshold. And I'm just surprised that the department has not produced any data whatsoever to say why we picked this option versus the other 3. We all requested it in last session to get data on this.
Your concerns are noted, Brad. I don't have anything else I can say about that now.
Well, I'll just mention one other thing on the calculation. So this 50% of the students at the institution are located in the state where the institution is located, do not use a national average. So I'm in 6 states in the Southeast with federal minimum wages of $7.50. But now I'm compared against wages in California and New York because I don't have 50% or more in one state. And so I'm curious why, for example, you picked the program, but a surgical tech in Tennessee is being compared with a high school earner from New York City.
Okay, it looks like there's no immediate response. So moving to Barmac next.
So
did you have more, Brad? I apologize.
No, I'm curious. So we're not going to state why we think it's okay to compare, especially programs in the Southeast, to the nation where based on where you're located, wages are less. I just would like an answer to that.
The only thing that I would say is I think the department has noted the objection and they might not have a response immediately prepared at this time.
I'll get a response for you.
Barmac.
Yeah, I'd like to speak in strong defense of the language that the department has here. To me, the choice of alternative thresholds like what? Poverty line, people paying money, the Department of Education spending money, people wasting their time so that they can live at poverty or 150% of poverty or earn minimum wage. I mean, those are laughable propositions. These are post-secondary programs intended to place people in jobs. And if those jobs end up earning less than they would have before they went in, That is the hill I would die on. That is just a ridiculous proposition to suggest that the feds need to invest money, people need to spend time so that they can make less than they would have as a high school graduate. So this is the correct index, in my opinion, is correct threshold. I also want to commend the department for the distinction it has made, a very rational one, in choosing working high school students and all GE graduates. The rationale for that is we don't know. Lots of people graduate from high school who voluntarily opt out of the labor force. It strains credulity to think somebody who doesn't intend to participate in the labor force will go through the effort of actually enrolling in a post-secondary program that is designed to place them in the labor force. So as sometimes things look like they're not parallels, this is the right parallel. It has to be working high school students and everybody who goes through the gainful programs. And in response to Brad's concern, I appreciate what he's saying. But consider the alternative. The alternative would be that online programs would get ensconced in low-wage states and then reach out and touch people in California and New York. So I think that 50% threshold is a very reasonable, prudent metric to ensure that we don't end up with online predatory programs dominating the field. So this provision, unlike a lot of other things I've said about the department, this provision is configured just right, and I would not alter any of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I do want to say, when we look at the earnings threshold, building on the low wage state issue there, so if the earnings threshold are based on the state in which the institution is located, if it's a brick and mortar institution, if we're going to use the example of a lower wage state, then that will be those students, the earnings against which it will be measured will be from that state. And I would say in the instance where a school chooses to be involved in distance education, and you have fewer than 50% of the students at that institution located in that state, it doesn't pass a reasonable test to say at that point that you would use the earnings in that state anymore, because a program like that is likely to not always, but likely to be a distance in a distance environment. And even if it isn't, then the people attending that school are not from that state, so it doesn't make any sense at that point to use the earnings just for people in that particular state if the students at the school are predominantly not from that state. So I don't think that prejudices the program.
Thank you, Johnson. See your hand next.
Yeah, I just want to say I think there was a discussion where we wanted to, if there was going to be a threshold, that it would be easily understandable, and this does make sense. People understand what a high school diploma is worth, and they go to college or continue their education after high school to increase their earnings. So I think it's completely justifiable here, and it certainly is something my clients would appreciate, having not gone to some schools that did not increase their earning power at all. I just left them with that.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you. I wanted to touch base on the cohort points and the 2-year cohort point in the kind of 3rd and 4th years for most programs, and then the 6th and 7th for the medical and programs given the residencies. And I know that this is something that's been in the rules since 2011. I went back and looked at the rationale for that, relating to the residencies between 3 and 8 years for those types of programs, and the need to kind of push out. If and I would just say, I don't have suggestion language, but if there was another approach for certain programs, if there's the same kind of rationale applies, I would be in support of having such programs kind of appeal to the department to basically allow for an extra year or so in the cohort period, if there's also similar licensure requirements that necessitate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
I just want to be clear for the record. that the request that I have here is not challenging the metric. It's just getting an understanding from the department so that this committee can vote on something they're seeing for the first time today. Really, we just found out the rate. The department didn't even know what the average national rate was until 15 minutes ago. And so it's just about the clarity and making sure we get a justification for why we're choosing what we're choosing. Remember, we are only applying this to a small percentage of programs. So we're basically saying the other 75% of students out there that attend these institutions not subject to gainful employment, we don't care if you make more than a high school earner. And so it's, to me, the unreasonableness is not the metric as much as the way it's been delivered to us, the timing we've had to review it. And we just heard from Cindy earlier today that we're going to be taking a consensus check on this later today. And we just found out what the number was. And that's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate that we're not taking this more serious and we're rushing it just to hit a November 1st deadline for this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Greg, I'm not seeing any additional hands on the definitions section. Do you want to pick us back up?
Sure. So we'll move on to section 668-403 on page 5. That is gainful employment framework. Thank you, Renee. So our first, and under A, program, gainful employment framework, general program that provides training that prepares students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation if the program, or I should say a program provides training that prepares students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation if the program satisfies the applicable certification requirements in 668-404 and is not an ineligible program under the DE rates. And you see the addition here of is not an ineligible program under the newly added earnings threshold measures. Just making that clarification. Going down to C, outcomes of the DE rates. A GE program passes the DE rates if its discretionary earnings rate is less than or equal to 20%, or its annual earnings rate is less than or equal to 8%, or if the denominator, that's the median annual or discretionary earnings of either rate, is 0, and the numerator median debt payments is 0. And then in 2, a GE program fails the DE rate if its discretionary earnings rate is greater than 20%, or the income for the denominator of the rate, median discretionary earnings, is negative or 0, and the numerator is positive, and the annual earnings rate is greater than 8%, or the denominator of the rate, which is the median annual earnings, is 0, and the numerator, median debt payments, is positive. Here, this is this change doesn't change anything over the way we produced the 2014 rates. So that the way we produce those rates is consistent with these edits. If both the debt and earnings are 0, the program passed. If the debt is non-zero and the earnings are 0, the program is failing. And so we've clarified that point throughout the section. And so I'll move on to C4. I'm sorry, I'm moving on to D rather. We'll move on to D, which is on page 6, and that's the earnings threshold measure. So this is new. This section walks through the framework for the earnings threshold measure. For each award year, Ed will assess the rate. The rate is passing if the median earnings exceed the threshold as defined in 668-402, which we just went through, or it is failing the median earnings equal, or it is failing if the median earnings equal or are less than the earnings threshold. The program becomes ineligible if it fails the earnings threshold measure in 2 out of any 3 consecutive years. So I'll walk through that with you since it is new. This is in D and E. So earnings threshold measure under D. For each award year, the Secretary assesses the GE program under the earnings threshold measure using the procedures in 668-405. And then looking at the outcomes of the earnings threshold measure, a GE program passes the earnings threshold measure if the median annual earnings of the students who completed the program exceed the earnings threshold. A GE program fails the earnings threshold measure if the median annual earnings of the students who completed the program are equal to or less than the earnings threshold. A GE program becomes ineligible, subject to paragraph D4 of this section, if it fails the earnings threshold measure in 2 of any 3 consecutive award years for which the program's median earnings threshold measure is calculated, except that failing the small program rate does not make those programs ineligible. If the Secretary does not calculate or issue earnings threshold measures for a program for an award year, or calculates only a small program measure with respect to that program, the program receives no result under the earnings threshold measure for that award year and remains in the same status under the earnings threshold measure as the previous award year. So that is the entirety of 668-403, the gainful employment framework. So I'll open it up for discussions and comments on that section.
All right, feedback for the department on the modifications to 403. Anne.
So thank you first for answering my initial question that you're just clarifying the language that was in the 2014 standards. But I had another question if we've discussed this, I apologize, I missed it. In the data, when you're looking at the earnings threshold, are you considering only full-time employees, or are you considering full and part-time in both categories, the GE earners and then also the high school graduates?
I just want to request a clarification on that for my group before I answer that question. So I should be getting that post haste.
Okay, thank you.
Steve, can you answer that off the top of your head? Or I'll wait. I'm going to wait for confirmation. I don't want to say anything.
Yeah, let's get clarification.
Thank you. Brad, I see your hand next.
Yes, we requested this data previously, and the department, I do not believe, has still answered the question. But on the thresholds of 8 and 20 now being the fail baseline for the 2-year losing your program versus the previous methodology of the zone and the 30 and 12 as the previous metrics to be the failing stick for the 2 of the 3 years versus the zone was, I believe, 4 years. Can the department describe why they eliminated the zone and why we believe 8 and 20 is appropriate metrics to determine gainful employment?
Well, the 8 and 20 rates are what we used in the previous rule, 14 rule. Of course, you're correct to say that in this rule we have eliminated the, the zone alternative. With the elimination of the zone, the rates, or rather the measure, will be more effective and more timely, addressing those programs where students' earnings don't allow those students to repay the debt they've taken on for those programs. So there isn't there is a desire here for the effect of the rates to be timely, and the elimination of the zone accomplishes that.
Brett, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I have an additional question for this section. So, Greg, I understand that there was a college scorecard technical review panel meeting that convened last week to discuss the potential of adding this earnings threshold metric to the public-facing website. And I believe, from what I understand, there were several researchers who participated and were concerned that using an earnings threshold measure, even for transparency, would be problematic. So could you give, or the department give us a brief summary of that meeting and how those concerns relate to what we're considering here for accountability purposes?
I was not at that meeting, and I'm not certain as to what occurred. I can certainly ask for an account of what happened there, but me addressing that right now would just be pure speculation. So I would wait to hear from somebody who was actually at the meeting.
Okay. Again, my concern, more so than the actual thresholds, is the time frame for loss eligibility. I mean, there's no appeals process. There's no transitional rates. There's if there is inaccurate earnings information being provided from wherever it's going to come from, if you fail 1 year based on the disclosure requirements in this pronouncement, your program is gone. And that is a significant, in this economy, for certain programs like nursing and other healthcare, and really a majority of all programs, that would be a very unfortunate thing to be implementing at this point in time. And so the 2 of the 3 years failing is my biggest concern that we're addressing here. And I'd like the department to consider going back to the 4-year metric that we had previously under the zone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Barmack.
I have raised this issue before, but I will raise it again in connection with the new language under outcomes, subsection E3, the introduction of a 2 out of 3 do-over. I have concerns about the construct to begin with. I'm not sure why we need to give people 2 out of 3 in a row. But that notwithstanding, my greater concern is about the fact that the department does not seem to be making any provisions for what happens to the students, particularly when the program does end up basically failing GE. If failure to generate wages above high school graduates' earnings represent a dashboard indicator of inadequacy of the program, why should the students that were allowed to go through that program candidly, recklessly, because the department didn't do a good enough job on the front end, why should those people not be awarded some kind of relief from the burden that was imposed on them, so that the department could make its determination that the program was not good enough? This is literally experimenting on live subjects. See, their lives are going to be altered by the fact of that debt, and particularly, again, when the program does fail. So I would really encourage the department to contemplate some remedy for these victims, because a more prudent approach would have been to prevent such programs from accessing federal aid in the first place. But now that they have accessed it and that you've used the students as the device by which you're going to determine program quality, at least in those cases where the program fails that quality assessment, students should receive some kind of consideration here. That's just as a moral proposition, if nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you, Barmack. So I just want to clarify something with you. But you're suggesting then that where a program failed the earnings threshold, that there would be some type of relief for those students in that particular program, based on the fact that we're not talking about, based on the fact that the program was forced to cease
The department is extending some consideration, and I understand that the attempt for soft landings and gradual sort of transitions. So if the department wants to extend, and the department has always extended the benefit of every doubt to schools, but in this case, if it wants to extend further benefits of the doubt, then at least cover the students that are being used as the instrumentation by which you measure quality. So yes, when programs fail metrics but are not rendered ineligible, and certainly when they are rendered ineligible, students should be somehow cured of at least the debt that they took on.
Okay, Ernest.
Yeah, I just honestly want to do what Barmek is saying here, and I want to acknowledge that I appreciate the department's reasoning, especially on getting rid of the zone, on wanting to kind of resolve these things quickly. Barmek's 100% right, though. Y'all, I don't know. I'm trying to be measured in saying this. The bar is the floor. I feel like the research when the original 2014 rule to the zone pointed to the 8 and 20 metrics as well, and the zone was kind of this measure of well, you know, I think it's appropriately put, giving the institutions the benefit of the doubt. I think that's fine, and I understand and even sympathize with some concerns of wanting to make sure that, you know, the data is correct, institutions are being treated fairly, et cetera, et cetera. But I would be remiss not to re-up again, especially in my seat, the impact that this has on real lives, real families. And to that end, I would strongly second and support some kind of, my colleague Amanda mentioned in the chat, victims compensation or fund, something that considers the impact of students who attend these programs. You know, I just don't, I think it is a moral consideration here, but also pointing to a grand scheme of things real quick, it's also a consideration of the potency of not just these programs, but all of higher education. I mean, regularly, higher education deals with the question of worth and is worth it, et cetera, et cetera. And I would point super quickly to the fact that, you know, wherever we're not taking advantage of quickly attempting to make students whole in this way, kind of adds to that, you know, adds to that kind of plethora of considerations that individuals make when they ask those questions. So, yeah, thank you. And just want to reiterate, I'm appreciative that kind of concerns were heard here about wanting to kind of cut the damage that's done over this.
Thank you.
I had to come off mute. So I'm seeing that it is noon. So I think with that, Ann, are you okay to hold this off till after lunch, or is it a brief comment?
Oh, I was just wondering if Greg had a response to my initial question. About
you know, I do not yet, but I'm breaking for lunch and I'll be in the department chat, so I will definitely have that for you after lunch. So if I neglect or forget, please raise it again. Okay.
Thank you.
Pick back up with, I think, the changes that are in section 668.404, right, Greg?
Yes.
So calculating the, okay, great. Well, we will see everyone at 1 o'clock. And again, thank you for the discussion today.